Well, hello everybody that's here with us and watching us. Thank you for joining us for Savannah Jewish Family Services Food for Thought program. Please note, if you have any questions during the program, please write them in the chat. We'll have Q&As at the end. Before we begin, I have a special announcement to make. We're going back in person. Starting August 5th at 12:30, we'll be having Food for Thought back at the JEA with interesting speakers and a delicious lunch. I hope to see many of you there. Well, for today's program, I'm honored to introduce Executive Vice President of Hazon, Shuli Karkowski. In her role, Shuli helps align every department with Hazon's mission and vision, managing and strengthening Hazon's programs, operations, development, marketing, communications, and finance. Thank you so much for joining us today, Shuli, and telling us all about Hazon.
Thank you, Sunny. And I just found out from Sunny that lunch is usually served at these. So I'm just expecting, I'm in Westchester, New York, which is a suburb of New York. And if you just want to email or mail a meal over, I'll be happy to eat it. I see a couple of people, Sharon and Carol, thanks for joining on the Zoom. And I hope there are some people watching on Facebook. I'm really grateful to talk to everyone. As Sunny mentioned, I work at Hazon. Hazon is a Jewish environmental nonprofit. It's actually the largest faith-based environmental organization in North America. And that's kind of surprising. And what we know now is that the environment is one of the most important issues, and it's going to be increasing in importance. And we're starting to see different actors do something about it. The government is starting to play a role. President Biden just proposed green legislation that's going to create significant infrastructure around greening the way we do business in America. We know that companies are starting to play a role in this. As just one example, Blackstone recently announced that they are only going to hold a portfolio of companies that are green and are no longer going to be investing in fossil fuels. So those are just a couple of examples. And one sector of society that we think has not played a sufficient role yet is our religious communities. I think our Jewish community is where we come together, where we speak for and about the things we care about most. And there is a tremendous amount of wisdom that Judaism offers about the environment. And part of what Hazon is trying to do is to get people who care a lot about being Jewish to think about how they can apply that to be a better environmentalist. And then go to environmentalists, to young people who are activists and care so much about greening the world, and say, do you realize that so much of what you're doing is part and parcel of your Jewish identity? And in that way, we're trying to convene a huge community of people that will become a movement to green the Jewish community altogether. With the vision being that in 7 years, if you walk into a Jewish institution, if you walk into the Federation in Savannah, you'll say, wow, the Jewish community really cares about the environment. You'll see bicycles, you'll see gardens, you'll see composting, you'll see sustainable food choices, you'll see educational curriculum based on the environment, and you'll be able to say, wow, that's what Judaism is all about. I'm so excited to see this piece of my Jewish identity represented by our Jewish institutions. So that's the very broadest concept behind Hazon. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal backstory and how I got here professionally, and then use it a little bit to talk more broadly about what's Jewish about the environment. So I grew up in the state of Maryland near Washington, D.C. I grew up modern Orthodox. So a relatively observant family, but also really open to the world, really questioning. It was a regular joke. There was no Shabbat dinner that passed that we didn't take out both the Chumash, the Torah, and an atlas and an encyclopedia. Like that's the kind of house I lived in. And I ended up going to law school at Harvard, and I was absolutely positive that that was the way I was going to change the world. I was really invested in international human rights. I worked at a clinic that was helping victims of some terrible massacres in India. But before I could sort of pursue those dreams, I needed to pay back my law school loans. And so I went and worked for a few years at a large law firm in New York called Paul Weiss, a really excellent law firm. And I was really good at it, and I really, really didn't love it. And I knew I wouldn't love it because I wanted to be saving the world, and I didn't feel like I was saving the world. But I also realized I didn't love the nuts and bolts of litigation, that the way I wanted to save the world wasn't by suing people, was not contentious, but was by building bridges and working with people. And I really, really missed the ability to collaborate with people. That was the thing I wanted to do most. And so I networked everywhere I could go, and ended up talking to a close friend who was at the Federation. The Federation in New York, the way that they raise money is through networking groups. So they have a whole group dedicated to Wall Street that raises by itself something like $45 million a year. There's a whole group dedicated just to lawyers, a whole group dedicated to entertainment professionals. And they invited me to become director of the lawyers division in New York. And I helped the Federation there raise money. And I'm deeply passionate about the work that Federation does. I think it is deeply countercultural to say, this is not about me as an individual. It's not about what I personally want to do with my money. It's about understanding that being a member of the Jewish community means taking on a collective responsibility. And I am still, I left Federation 8 years ago. I still give significant money of my philanthropic money to Federation because I truly believe in what Federation does. And the thing I also loved about Federation was there was a deep recognition that we need to serve our own community, that the Jewish community is our responsibility, and a Holocaust survivor, the poor, single mothers, none of those people who are part of our community should ever go hungry, should ever want for basic human needs or even psychological needs. And at least in New York, the Federation also recognized that it was part of the fabric of New York and had a responsibility to the broader community. And it turned its lens beyond just the Jewish community and out to the world. And when I realized how compelling I found it to take my Jewish identity and turn it out into the world, I started to think about what was the greatest contribution Judaism could offer to the world. And as I looked down the pike to drastic climate change coming our way, I thought there's no greater way I can use my Jewish identity than to help with the environment. So over time, I came to work at Hazon, which has been an amazing organization. And before I talk about the programs of Hazon, I want to answer the question that's the subject of what we're talking about today, which is, what is Jewish about the environment? You know, we all know there's sort of very broad ideas of tikkun olam, that we want to make the world a better place, but that applies to every important issue out there. And there's a lot of deeply important issues out there. But I think the Jewish approach to the environment goes even deeper than that. It happens to be a very opportune time to be speaking to you because in exactly 2 months is the start of the new Shemitah year. Shemitah is sort of an obscure concept unless you grew up in Israel, and every Israeli knows what Shemitah is. Most American Jews don't know what Shemitah is. Does anyone on the call? Usually I would ask this question, but Sharon, I don't know if you want to chime in. Do you know what Shemitah is, or Carol?
I do know what Shemitah is, and I am familiar with your organization.
Awesome. Do you want to try to just what
well,
in your
it is a, it's a biblical requirement to allow the plants to have a rest period, a Shabbat for our environment, and it gives us an opportunity also to deal with the biblical question, one that we actually deal with in this week's Parsha, of vows. And although the vows between man and man are not necessarily discussed, it more is women to, and her relationship to her betrothed and her father. In this week's, the idea of making a commitment is something that by the time we get to Yom Kippur, we really are very familiar with because vows made from man to man have to be settled. So Shemitah gives us an opportunity to give the earth a break, but at the same time, a reckoning time to give us the opportunity to settle all vows between man and man.
So Carol,
in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's you answered better, I think, than I even could myself. So that's exactly right. So when biblically, there's in the biblical story of the Jews entering the land of Israel, God tells them one of the very first commandments they get from God is that every 7 years, there's going to be Shmitat Haaretz, a rest year, a sabbatical year for the land. And actually, if you know anyone in academia, anyone in the world who's ever taken a sabbatical year, the concept of sabbatical is based on Shemitah, explicitly started at Harvard University, where they decided, like, what does it mean to take a year of rest every so often? And so the concept of Shemitah has a couple of different elements. One is, Carol referenced a lot of them really beautifully. So one of them is every 7 years, you hold back from tilling, plowing, gathering on your, from plowing or tilling your land. You're not allowed to work the land. And it's a fascinating concept. If you're an agrarian society, you're barely making do year to year, even when you're trying your hardest to get everything you need out of the land. And then suddenly there's a year where you're not allowed to work it at all. And you're only allowed to glean basically that which grows itself. And even then, there's complicated rules about what you have to leave for the poor to be able to glean, what corners are left for those who can't afford land or aren't landowners. So there's a lot of really amazing concepts that are brought in by this. One is about planning for the long-term future, which feels extremely poignant today. What does it mean to think about land, not something as we own, not something we can exploit as much as we want to, but something that we have to plan very far in advance to know that we're gonna, one, give the land a rest when it needs to rest, and two, not constantly exploit its resources. That's one of the most important things that I take away from Shemitah. As Carol mentioned, it's also a moment where you think about the vows you've made to your fellow human beings and have to sort of settle any debts. And so Shemitah happens every 7 years, and then every 7 Shemitah cycles, so every 49 years, there's something called the Jubilee year, the Yovel. And in that moment, any existing debt is eradicated. Anyone who in biblical times was held as a slave was set free. And this was also a revolutionary idea at the time. It totally changes the way we think about commerce and capitalism, because yeah, people should own personal property. There are loans out there. People should be able to make a beautiful living. And then there's a year where we sort of have to lay free any debts. We completely free people from the things that are holding them back. It's another really beautiful concept we get from Shemitah. But more than anything, I guess, as we come on the Shemitah year, we've been thinking about it as a way to think about 7-year cycles of time. And where do we, Hazon, as an organization, want to be in 7 years? And where do we want the Jewish community to be in 7 years? What would it look like for the Jewish community to say, we are going to use this 7-year cycle of Shemitah to change the way that we look at the land, to change the way that we approach the land as something to exploit, and think about it as something that we owe a duty to. Shabbat also is a similar concept, thinking about when we want to rest and don't want to take advantage and aren't only thinking about being as effective and efficient as possible. I went to Harvard Law School. I worked at one of the top law firms in New York. I can say there's an American obsession with effectiveness and efficiency. In many ways, it's amazing and has led to an industrious work ethic and some of the greatest parts of America. And also, I think there's a recognition that we work harder than we need to. And as a result, we consume more than we need to. I was actually just talking to my husband, who was talking about a theorist. I think it was Keyes had theorized that by the mid 1900s, productivity would be so high that people would have to work a maximum of 15 hours a week to meet their basic needs. And I think we all look around. I don't know anyone who considers themselves a working person who works 15 hours a week. And what we've come to understand is that what we consider basic needs keep changing. It's called contrived demand. It's the idea that no matter how much we work, there's always something more we want to get. We always need more things, more luxury items, more expensive items. And so there's a consumerism built in that makes us just think, work more and more, get more and more. And there's a real healthy aspect of saying, pause. Take a Shabbat. Don't work for a little bit. Think about what's important to you. Take a deep breath. Spend time with family. Spend time with friends. Spend time with people who are important to you. It's a really powerful and particularly revolutionary idea in America. Another concept that's talked about a lot at Hazon is Ba'al Tashchit, which is the idea that you just shouldn't waste, and how the way we live our lives today is so casual about waste. Since I started working at Hazon, have just noticed how many times I finish a bag of bread and everything is wrapped in 3 different kinds of plastic. And each and every piece of plastic basically just goes straight into the trash. And an environmental educator I was talking to said COVID particularly was this like really, really wild time where there was a minute near the very beginning of the pandemic crisis where we didn't know what we'd have access to. Well, we didn't know if stores were going to run out of bread or plastic bags or toilet paper. And he remembered very particularly taking the twisty tie off the bread and like putting it aside. Because like, who knows I'm going to need that twisty tie? What's going to be available to me? And I don't think he ended up using the twisty tie again. But that concept of like the way we so casually throw things away is something both Judaism and this pandemic moment have made us really question. How could we do things different? How could we use less and get rid of less? And the last thing I'll mention, just sort of what's Jewish about the environment is, I mean, Carol sounds like she's quite well educated, but if you like really deeply Jewishly literate, and if you look at both the Torah, but especially the Mishnah and Talmud, you encounter a Judaism that's basically agrarian. So much of it is about how and when you pray for rains, and what happens when your oxen bores another oxen, and what if it bores a human, and what happens if you trip on a rock on someone else's land. And it helps you remember that full millennium of Jewish history was agrarian and agricultural, and that our lives look very, very different from that. No matter how traditional a Jew you are, we definitely don't live our lives that way anymore. And so there's really something really powerful about going back to those early texts and reading them with the eyes of modernity and saying, wow, what can we apply? We're no longer agrarian, but there's so many lessons to be learned here. I have a text sort of in my back pocket. I don't know if we'll have time for it or not, but I have a great example that we might go into later in this hour session. And then the last thing I'll say, that's what's Jewish about the environment. But the last thing to think about is I come from a generation, and certainly the generations younger than me, I'll include Sunny in that, who really are most passionate about turning the wisdom of Judaism out into the world. And so I think I grew up just at the cusp of Jewish activism that was about Soviet Jewry and about sort of protecting our people. And I think we've entered a new moment in Jewish history where our youngest and brightest Jews are saying, I don't want to take my Jewish identity and turn it only into the Jewish world. I want to be using it to look outward into the entire world. And I think if Jewish institutions don't start taking environmental concerns seriously, they're going to lose the best and brightest of our Jewish community, because it's what young people care about today. And we see that in the Greta Thunbergs of the world. Hazon has a young movement called the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. It started with 25 leaders, and within months, it's grown fivefold. So it launched in the middle of the pandemic. We asked any teenager, so anyone between the age of 13 to 17 who's still in high school, can join the movement. And the passion of these people is unbelievable. And they have said, environmental activism is a huge part of my life. Having grown up as a Jewish person is a huge part of my life. And there was always a disconnect that I never had the opportunity to bring those things together. These are the two things in the world I care most about. And it means so much to have that opportunity to bring things together. And I think they're just one example of how important it is to capture young people today for the Jewish community to take the environment seriously. So here's a couple of programs that Hazon does that you can take on right now and be a part of this movement. You can engage young people, but also just be part of the solution yourself. One of them is the Brit Hazon. Brit means promise or covenant. It's a very deeply Jewish word, like Brit Milah, which is what we do to young boys when they're 8 days old and brings them into the tribe of Judaism. And the Brit Hazon is saying, make a covenant. Hazon means vision. Make a covenant of vision, and make a commitment that you're going to be part of the solution. And if you go on our website, you basically sign the Brit. You say, I'm going to be a part of this. And we ask you to do 3 things. One of them is just to make a commitment to change your behavior in some way, any way. And we have a number of different resources you can sign up that tell you different things you personally can do. How do you consume more local produce so that you bring down the gas emissions that come from getting your food? How do you start composting so you throw fewer things out? How do you buy your clothes more locally so that there's less time spent traveling, those kinds of things. And there's a full, I think there's 6 different email series. How do you eat more vegetarian food? Meat is a huge contributor to climate emissions, in addition to being very, very hard on animals. And I don't think Hazon at any point thinks everyone in the world is going to become vegan. But how can we each make tiny little incremental changes in our diet? Commit to 1 day a week that you're not going to eat any animal products or that you won't eat meat. So that's one thing you can do. So the Brit Hazon is committing to a personal commitment to change your behavior. 2 is getting involved in some way with an organization doing this work. It can be Hazon, it can be another environmental nonprofit, it could be another Jewish environmental nonprofit, someone that's taking the environment seriously. And 3rd, to start speaking out. Talk to some place like Savannah Federation and create a cohort of people who say, we care about this. Will you help us be part of the change? The second thing we encourage is joining the Hazon Seal of Sustainability. That is a tool we offer to institutions like the Federation. And what we do is we go to different Jewish organizations and say, we think it's critically important for you to show the people who come to your organization that you care about the environment. And we give you access to a portal where you get to input lots of information. Here's how many light bulbs we have, and here's the kinds they are. Here's our heating bill. Here's how we dispose of trash. And that portal spits out lots of different recommendations for really easy ways to cut down and have less environmental impact with your Jewish nonprofit. At the same time, the projects we ask you to take on, 1, help lessen your detrimental impact on the environment. But the second thing they do is they also help you teach. We'll show you how to start a garden for young people that gets them excited. My children go to a Jewish day school that has a little food garden on the roof, and they farm at least once a week, and they now understand where food comes from, and they're so excited about it. And my son came home and was so excited. He loved the taste of kale flowers. Like, it's just wild to see how much kids get out of these educational resources and how much it deepens their understanding of Judaism to put that environmental piece into it. Another thing Hazon does is something we called Jaffe programming. Jaffe stands for Jewish Outdoor Food, Farming, and Environmental Education. So I just mentioned we'd love for Jewish institutions to have environmental curriculum. We'd love for them to have things like gardens or compost bins that have little signs explaining to people what it means to compost. But we also know that the best way to have a big impact is to train leaders that then go on to train more leaders that could then go on to train additional people. And that's how you have a real multiplier effect. And so Hazon for the last 20 years has basically been training Jewish environmental educators. We have a 3-month intensive farming fellowship on our farm in Connecticut called the Adama Fellowship. We have a program for middle schoolers called Teva that's also in the New York and Baltimore area. We have environmental education training programs, Jewish environmental education training programs, so that someone can teach in those programs and learn how to be a teacher and then go on. And what we've seen from those programs is I know of at least 36 different Jewish environmental organizations that were created because people went through our training and said, I want to contribute to this movement. I want to speak out and bring more people into what you're doing, and have become Jewish environmental educators. And not only that, it's proof of what I said before. I would say a lot of the people who do those trainings would have said coming into it that they don't have a terribly strong Jewish identity. They would never see themselves becoming part of the Jewish professional world. And dozens of them are now running their own Jewish nonprofits. And so we see this in addition to people really understanding the environment, we really see how much it strengthens people's Jewish identity to connect it to the environment that they care so strongly about. And then finally, one thing Hazon is really, really proud of is I mentioned that we're the largest faith-based environmental organization in North America. So even though Jews are only, I think, 4%, 2% of the American population, we are the largest faith-based organization. And so part of this is being Or LaGoyim, which means a light unto the other nations. How can we take what we learn about Jewish environmentalism and create a little study book for Hinduism, for Catholicism, for other strands of Christianity, and for Buddhism? And we are actually in regular communications we were asked to attend a number of different convenings, both at the UN level and at the Vatican, about the climate, as religions have started to take more attention to environmental issues, and starting to show other religious institutions how they can incorporate environmentalism into religious life and help all faith-based communities become part of the change today. So, I mean, if I got anything out of this conversation with everyone, my hope would be that a lot more people get excited about living out their Jewish identity through the environment and thinking about how they can use, all the young people around them, if you have grandkids, if you have other people who, slowly drifting away from Judaism, to show them that Judaism has so much to offer to a contemporary Jew who cares about the broader world. And I'll just show, I was going to share one screen, and I'll share one screen, which is, right now I'll just share this, which is, these are my kids. They're very delicious. And I just think about, I may not be alive in 2100, but my kids will. And they might live in a very, very different world because they're alive in 2100. And as soon as I had children, climate change became really real for me. I started thinking about the world that I'm leaving behind to those children, and what I owe to them. And so, I don't know, I'm sure everyone on this call, either you have children or you have loved ones who are younger who will have children, or you have someone in your life who you care about who will be alive in 2100. And it's just really important for me to think about what we're leaving for future generations, and how important to Jewish continuity is the concept of human continuity, and how we really need to do something about the environment. So I have a text study, but I want to stop there and just give an opportunity for discussion or questions. And then if we have a lot of extra time, I'll do the text study. But I also would love to get engaged in conversation instead.
Sharon, do you have something? Unmute.
I find it very interesting. I never thought, I do try to be very careful recycling and things like that, but I just never thought of it in terms of Judaism, that I was doing it. And that is, a good thing to think about. I'd like to share the recording with my children and let them be aware even more so. There are some areas that still do not recycle, and not in our city, but I know in other cities, and that is really too bad. Maybe they can work on getting something done in their communities.
I love that, Sharon. You're like the best audience. That is exactly what we want you to take away from it. You nailed it. Thank you.
I actually, I have tried for many years to work on various environmental issues at our Jewish Community Center. Mm-hmm. And I had started years ago a building and grounds, and I tried to get recycling. This was about 20 years ago. I'm a lot older than you are. And I tried to get recycling, and with varying amount of success. I tried to, they put out the bins, but within the building itself, there was no emphasis on people recycling. So you've got to recycle your plastic water jugs here, but there was no rule, when they were having a catered event, they were taking the plastic soda and just throwing it in the garbage. So it's just, it was a very superficial, I think, just to keep people who cared about this sort of thing quiet. I started a building and grounds committee years ago to study, and besides the fact that we have an old building, to study the efficacy of solar panels. And after spending months and months and months, it was very clear that the board just had no interest in this at all. So it was the same thing with garden. I did plans for a community garden. They ended up doing a garden, but not before 3 blocks away. I started a community garden just to show that it could be done, and it could be done to take herbs and replace salt and sugar in children's diet. The thing is, there's a total inconsistency. Um, because it was monetarily more efficacious to change out the light bulbs or to alter use of light bulbs, the board decided to, with our executive director, to change the type of light bulb, to alternate this, because there was a dollar and cents incentive for doing such. Years ago, I tried to get, and this is the last comment before I actually ask a question, I tried to get the Jewish National Fund to provide us with an intern at the community center to help us implement a series of programs that included education about Israel as an agrarian society by using our property as a lab or a workshop in environmental change. That didn't go over well at all with a whole lot of people. But what I noticed that is different right now, because I am familiar with your organization, is I did go on the website before we started to see that there have been a lot of changes over the last few years, in that you really are implementing a lot of the policy that you just talked about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you, in that, you talked about your internship program. Through our federation, would it be possible to set up, to offer them the opportunity to set up a matched fund to get young people from our area to take your internship the same way we sign up young people for Birthright? And I will tell you just an aside before I shut up and let you talk. And that is that we did have a young woman in the community who went to the Pearlstone Center. Are you familiar with that? Okay.
Yeah.
And she was working for them for years. And her father actually was a partner of my husband's. And I tried. I said, don't you want your daughter to move back to Savannah? Now that she's been at the Pearlstone Center, how about we try and find her a salary so she could keep doing what she was doing there and do it here? But that wasn't the way to work it. The way to work it is that we institute an internship program with maybe your organization through your Jaffe education program or whatever. And then their requirement is that maybe you match the funds with our federation, and then they have to work off the time by bringing back a program to this community. Is something like that doable?
So first of all, you're very much speaking my language, Carol, which is the question of how does Hazon, which is a national organization, partner with local institutions to create real change on the ground? So that the question you're asking is like the biggest question we think about every day. And I think right now we have a number of different ways that can happen. So I don't know this specific matching funds for a particular fellow. It is something we've done in the past. It's not a current program, although it's something we're thinking of bringing back. And I will be back to Savannah to talk to you guys about it if we do. But honestly, if there's any kind of noise making from the members of a community to the Federation, to the JCC, to the institutional leadership, what we found is they do reach out to us, and then there's always a way for us to work together. I mentioned one of them, which is the Hazon Seal of Sustainability, which is that audit that then spits out like a lot of really easy to do projects here. And it's exactly what you said, Carol. It's not just like, let's talk about how you switch out your light bulbs, but some real clear resources. Like if you're going to start a little garden, here's what you need to buy, here's what you need to do, here's when you should start to plant it, here's how you start a community garden at your JCC. So really making it as easy as possible for organizations to take advantage of these resources. One more thought, and then I want to go to Sharon. And then the most important thing, the biggest change we've been seeing recently is we've been going to regions and institutions and saying, come be part of the Seal of Sustainability, take on these projects. And they'll say, our number one priority right now, especially coming out of the pandemic, is re-engaging our young people. And so in response to that, we started offering a hybrid Seal of Sustainability Jewish Youth Climate Movement Kfutza or chapter. And so much like you have BBYO chapters or USY chapters, sort of the Jewish youth movements have chapters that young people can come be part of a community. We've been going to regional institutions and saying, start a chapter for Jewish youth in your community. And you will see all of these movements that are having trouble drawing young people in. It's exactly the opposite. We will see tons of people begging to be part of this Jewish climate movement. Young people are coming, banging down our door saying, how do I be a part of this? Please let me be a part of this. We just opened up our leadership committee. I think we had 5 open slots, and I think we got something like 100 applications from the most amazing young people in the world who are desperate to be a part of Jewish environmentalism. And so I think that's another really smart way for us to structure a partnership with some institutions in Savannah. Now, Sharon, I'll come back to you, Carol, but just Sharon, it looked like you had a question.
I just wanted to say, do y'all have anybody that ever goes to lobby in Congress? Because there's such a divide there. Some do not even believe that we're in a climate change or, won't accept it. So I didn't know if y'all do any lobbying in Congress.
It's a great question. I have a couple of answers. So one is we are always looking for better laws and policies around the environment. We don't have any paid lobbyists, but we do have something called the Hazon Action Alert, and I think it's a brilliant tool. And it basically points you in the direction of legislation we don't realize is about the environment and helps you understand. So for instance, the Farm Bill, which is massive and, I'm being honest, extremely boring. It is a omnibus bill with tons and tons of things packed into it. People kind of ignore it because it's called the Farm Bill. It's not sexy. It's not about any of the big issues that come up. And so we'll send you an action alert saying, call your congressperson and say, you want to see incentives for smaller, locally grown organic farms to thrive. You want to see incentives that help lower the carbon emissions, that help incentivize vegetarian food, all kinds of things that are good for the earth. So we do provide tools for individual people to be involved in the advocacy process in really easy ways. It's like, here's a template, literally fill out this form with your name online, send it to your congressperson, and you've done your mitzvah for the day. The other thing I will say is that we are not as directly focused on lobbying and advocacy, but there are Jewish environmental organizations that are, and we partner closely with them. The ones I would name are JCAN, the Jewish Climate Advocacy Network, I think is what that stands for, and Dayenu are both excellent advocacy organizations. Hazon does some advocacy, but also is very involved in educating people and helping them take personal action. And then for people who want to take that extra step and are ready to storm the halls of Congress, we tend to partner with those partner Jewish organizations. Carol, did you have other questions or any responses, or Sunny?
Actually, I would love to hear the text study, but Sunny, I'm going to ask you this. In light of what seems like 4 very specific things that we could do in this community in order to partner with Hazon, what
Carol, Sharon, you both have jobs at Hazon forever. You're so good at this.
What would be the best way to approach it? I mean, it boils down to some very simple things, is to get that seal of sustainability, which helps us advertise that we are an environmentally conscious community, to approach our BBYO chapter and see if they would like to add the element. So we're not reinventing the wheel with another youth group, which we don't have what my husband calls critical mass. We don't have, all those extra kids hanging around, but we do have enough to have a BBYO chapter give them the mission for this year, especially tying it into a Shemitah year, so it makes it very thematic, to go ahead and add this, your youth challenge, as one of the challenges that they take on as social action. But also I would think that I really like the idea of that internship and bringing someone back. It really does mirror something that I tried to do and was miserably unsuccessful. But I think that this could work because you already have the infrastructure to make it work. It's just a matter of finding the funding. And we've already finished appropriations for this year, but we do have a way of getting individuals to vote for how they want to spend some unallocated community funds. Sharon, you would know more about this than I, because I've never actually sat on Federation's board, but that might be a way to find our portion of an internship if in factually your organization can approach the powers that be. So how do we get this to work?
Yeah, so these are all great ideas, but I just think that we'll talk about them between us, and I'm happy to share with you Shuli's contact information, and we can all talk about them a little bit later. And yeah, we would love to hear, Shuli, your text portion that you can share with us.
And I'll just add, these are slow conversations, and federations are, I mean, I worked at Federation, so I both have tremendous respect for Federation and know they can't turn on a dime and suddenly there's, you know, massive amounts of money and it's all going to the environment. And I think the best thing that could happen is that this becomes a continuing conversation, and there's some kind of dialogue both with Federation lay leaders who are passionate about this work, and hopefully with Federation staff who can make something happen. And I don't think it'll happen tomorrow or even the next day, but I would love to continue to be in touch and make some of this a reality on the ground. That would be really special. All right, you guys are hungry for a text study. Sharon, are you into text study? Do you like it? Did we lose you? Yeah. So I'm going, let me just pull it up. And I would love, let me just make it a little bigger. Great. I'm going to ask you guys to help me read it. Okay. Carol and Sharon, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, does someone want to start reading, just very slowly start reading the English, and I'll start sort of talking through it as you read it to us.
Oh, I don't mind.
Yeah.
Just down the center or to the...
Yeah, starting with our sages taught.
All right, our sages taught a man should not move stones from his ground to public ground.
Oh, so just stop there. What do our sages saying we shouldn't do? So a man should not move stones from his ground. So you live somewhere, you're at your house, you're on your lot, your farm, and you take stones from your house and you just start like pushing them out onto public land. Don't do that. Why not? Okay, carry on, Carol.
A certain man was moving stones from his ground onto public ground when a pious man found him doing so and said to him, "Fool, why do you move stones from ground which is not yours to ground which is yours?" And the man laughed at him.
So pause for a second. So a man owns his own land, and he's taking stones from his land and he's moving them onto different land that's public. And it says a pious man. So this is not a rabbi, but this is just like a genuinely sensitive, smart, person with good intent says to him, "Why are you doing this?" And the man just laughs at him. He's like, "I'm doing what I get to do. I can throw my trash anywhere I want." Okay, so Carol, carry on.
Some day later, the man had to sell his field, and when he was walking on the public ground, he stumbled over those same stones. He then said, "How well did that pious man say to me, why do you move stones from ground which is not yours to ground which is yours?"
Great. So what happens to the man who he just thoughtlessly started putting the rocks he didn't want, he starts putting them on public land, and what ends up happening to him, Carol or Sharon, if you want to share what happened to him.
Well, it is, all ground is ground. All of it is God's ground. So we carve out our own little section and we say, this is mine, but it's not our creation. It's God's creation. And, and there's this one about you don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind man. And here it's not that the people that will be stumbling across that are blind but maybe they're blind to the significance of the fact that all ground belongs to God, and we're only caretakers.
And I want to, Carol, to exactly that point, I just want to point out a really beautiful language piece that's part of this text, which is when the pious man comes to talk to him, he says, "Why do you move stones from ground which is not yours to ground which is yours?" Meaning the man laughed at him because the pious man said to him, "Why are you taking stones from land that is not yours?" His private land he's calling not yours. And he's saying you're moving it to land that is yours, to the public land. And that's why he laughed at him. He's like, "What are you talking about? I'm taking stones off land that is mine and moving it to land that's not mine. I'm getting rid of a problem." And he didn't realize how wise this pious person was in reversing those things and saying, land that you think is yours is not actually yours, which is one really important point that you just pointed to, Carol. And then also the opposite, land that is public is yours. And one way to think about this is like, who owns public land? Who owns what's the national park closest to Savannah? I should know. Maybe Smoky Mountain, let's say. Like who owns that national park?
You do.
We do. The government does, some people say.
Yeah.
And then some people, a lot of the time we do. And then if you go a step further, one thing that people never say, but is also true, that's mine. And what does it mean if I think about all of these public spaces, not as even just our land, but as my land? I start treating them very, very, very differently. And I mean, I think I would love to see, like, does anyone have a thought about how this reflects on, our current environmental world? I would love to see if it's like sparking any ideas for the way we treat our world.
Well, as always, I have an opinion. Sorry about that. But
Love it, Carol.
it is, so I do a program where I collect used plastic bags, and we crochet them into mats for the homeless. And I have people that give me, they drop the trash in front of my house. So my husband makes them crazy. And I'll call them up and I'll say, for 10 more minutes, you can take that plastic bag and you can actually turn it into plastic yarn. All you have to do is fold it, cut it, and ribbon it together, tie it together. And then you make these plastic yarn balls. And I had somebody, I have a lot of people, and then I take them to the next step. You can put it on a loom, you can braid it, you can crochet it. And then we have this mat, and then we distribute them. And it's like teaching children each step of the way. But I still have some people who feel like they're doing me personally a very big job. They're donating to me personally their garbage, their plastic bags. And I should be so grateful that they're doing this. And I am. But they still don't get the fact that I'm taking the bags off their hands, but they're not giving a gift to me. They're giving a gift to themselves, because it removes that plastic bag from the landfill or from the street or from the water stream. And so ultimately we all benefit because they gave me their bag. But the recognition isn't there, that they are in any way have a relationship to the fact that this trash was theirs to begin with.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And I sometimes teach this text to, I recently did it with a group of bat mitzvah girls, so 12-year-olds. And I said, what does this mean in the environmental world? And they're 12, so they sort of rolled their eyes at me and they were like, "We know, don't litter." And I was like, yes, don't litter. Good, I like it. And like, what happens when you don't litter and you put it in a garbage can? Then where does it go? They're like, I don't know, it goes in garbage. And I'm like, yeah, but where does that garbage go? And they're like, I don't know, the garbage man picks it up. And then where does it go? I guess into a dump, and or in the ocean. Or, have you thought about the ways that we take our rocks and move them elsewhere? And it doesn't even have to be things we throw out. It could be when I use my car, like, where does that air go? That air is going into our air, into my air. And so we are constantly taking rocks from our own ground and putting them onto public ground. And somewhere out there's a righteous person laughing, saying, why are you taking things from land that is not yours and putting them on land that is yours. So I find this text extremely powerful. It's good. I mean, there's a million texts like this that Jewish tradition brings that are extremely poignant stories that really bring home how Jewish it is to care about the environment. I am so great. Carol, Sharon, Sunny, you guys were very, very helpful in learning this text. This was such a joy to learn with all of you. And I think I'll close on that and just say thank you for listening so beautifully and for really understanding exactly what we're talking about.
Thank you for
Thank you so much, Julie.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Sunny,
much.
thank you, Savannah Federation.
Thank you so much. And just before we close, I would like to invite everybody else to join us at the same time and the same link for next week. We'll have Sarah Poland from Israel Link talking to us about how to have conversations about Israel. So again, thank you, Julie, so much. I learned personally a lot about whose responsibility it is and who needs to be in charge of their own things, even though it's maybe the government or the world or everybody's together, everybody has a responsibility of their own as well. So thank you so much. See you everybody next week.
So nice to meet you all. Thank
you.
you.